Valheim is one of the most successful survival games in the genre. It became such a success due to a handful of core elements. First, the game benefits from high difficulty that is mitigated by a process, first of exploration, of finding out how biomes differ from one another, how enemies attack, and therefore how we should respond. We explore various foods and weapons and clothing. So therefore, second, we begin to dominate the biome. Through violence and knowledge, we are able to mitigate the harsher aspects of each biome, thwarting the game by using weapons, tools, and items. Finally, we domesticate the biome. We take from it that which we need, and we build structures that allow us to stake a claim, either within that biome or elsewhere, perhaps trivializing the biome for the player character in the future. For example, in the Black Forest, once a player has created armors well past this biome, the terrifying destructive power of the troll has become a joke, and with advanced weapons, the troll goes down easily. With higher skills in running, jumping, and with more complex food recipes, a player may avoid trolls entirely. None of this was the case for when the player encounters the Black Forest biome for the first time. Here we can see the appeal of Valheim, and as long as the biomes proliferate in this way, the game is relatively straightforward and cathartic. But of course, the game does not have endless biomes, and the game does not strictly adhere to this structure of biomes, and even within this progression of exploration, domination, and domestication, there are some ambiguities within it that I would like to discuss. Let's begin with the biomes. As everyone knows, eventually the player will encounter the Mistlands biome. For those uninitiated, the Mistlands biome is surrounded by a fog, one that a player must use wisp torches to remove. The amount of torches required to remove fog is quite large, and though the construction of them is easy, a player would have to work diligently or enlist in the aid of a massive amount of players in order to completely remove the fog from their world. Sight is a key component of the player as it is the character, so using a core function of playing the game as a limiting factor is a big risk. This is why we have seen an incredible backlash against the Mistlands by the community as being too big of a problem. Let's contrast this with another feature of the Mistlands, its verticality. Mistlands is full of massive spires that go up and down steeply, forcing characters to run and jump continuously. This uses lots of stamina. The idea of this challenging terrain is quite simple, and follows the rule of the mountains biome, which is that a player must have built up or conditioned their character with a high run and jump skill in order to mitigate the effects of the Mistlands. This particular problem has seen less of a backlash because players have an avenue for mitigating the problem that is more universal to the character rather than the player. Here we can see that Valheim takes the domestication of the Mistlands biome, i.e. removing fog through building wisp torches, as an explicit component of dominating the biome. No matter what the skill or equipment of the character, a player will always have to contend with the mist. Keep that in mind as we discuss the ambiguity in Valheim between domination and domestication. In my mind, a key tension in Valheim exists between the nomadic style and the domestic one. If a player were to play Valheim without building a settlement, they risk some increasingly deadly variables. Their equipment would remain rather basic, making their domination through violence of enemies more difficult, would make their battle against the elements limited, and would keep their health and stamina rather low. Further still, they would not be able to be rested for very long. A character could create a makeshift structure with a bed, but this bonus would be rather short-lived. Creating more advanced structures would be out of the question, which means a higher comfort level, thereby increasing the duration of the rested buff, would also be limited. Chance of death would be much higher, which means for a standard game, a character would lose precious experience and skills. Given all these problems, a player will rarely fully support the nomadic playstyle. Instead, far more time has been spent in praising the domesticated and static playstyle. Players make elaborate structures. Players use technology with steep requirements, which requires them to place productivity structures like furnaces, kilns, smelters, and cooking utensils. Players must return continuously to repair their advanced equipment, which means they must return to their upgraded crafting stations, all of which take many resources. Returning often given the size of a Valheim world, necessitates the use of portals. The fact that portals cannot be used with precious metals means that the determining factor for the location of many bases comes down to the proximity of these precious metals. Hopefully you can see that the features in Valheim of building a base have been accentuated far more than those of the Nomadic playstyle. It is almost impossible to do one of these, and downright necessary to do these for another. With the introduction of Mistlands, this emphasis on stationary living over nomadic living were leveraged to the hilt. A whole new set of crafting stations were introduced with Mistlands, all of which required the use of very advanced tools, which stood on the shoulders of giants in the form of requirements from the previous biomes. This means that creating bases, in particular new bases, became a taller and taller order. And as we have discussed before, no matter how strong of a character we create, a player will always have to contend with the process of domesticating the Mistlands, given its limitation of eyesight as a core feature. The key critique to Valheim, I think, can be found somewhere in here, because it has several implications for the world which are interesting to discuss. First and foremost, it makes the world of Valheim appear not too small, but rather far larger than it needs to be. At 6 times the size of Skyrim, with many repeating and redundant areas, once the player builds what they believe will be their main base, the rest of the world becomes far more noise than signal. Now, the makers of the game are fully aware of this problem, which is why one of their later updates, Hildir's Request, attempts to fill out these biomes with bespoke mini-boss battles to encourage exploration beyond simply the ritual of exploration, domination, and domestication we discussed before. In my mind, it is not enough. One fix is obvious. Fill in the world more and more with these bespoke events, like the kind found in Hildir's Request, which provides players with interesting tools that make the nomadic or exploratory playstyle more rewarding. Personally, I don't think this is a feasible critique, given the length of the game in early access already, and the pace of development from the team, which is glacially slow as it is. Let's not forget to mention the technical problem that many players have already established worlds and servers maintained for years that would be unable to access this new content within those old worlds. Another solution, which in my mind is a better one, is to shrink the size of the world, or at the very least allow players to determine the size of the world. As much as I believe in my critique here, one limitation of it is easy to see, which is that people like to build and domesticate, regardless of how they feel about the Mistlands, and for them this domination of biomes through base construction is kind of the whole point. Other players, like me, see the act of building a single base to be missing out on so much space that the game world provides, space that would be much more manageable for players, even larger communities, if the world was smaller. This has a few knock-on effects that would be beneficial to players. Redundancy in biomes would be reduced as there would hopefully be less of all the biomes, making them that much more important. Locations for bases would therefore become much more appealing, as the spaces between biomes would be less as well. The space between resources would be less, though still a challenge, and would allow for far more bases and far more nomadic of a playstyle, with bases now serving particular functions, rather than a single base serving all functions. Imagine a Valheim world that was a quarter of the size we have now. I'm sure smaller communities and servers would appreciate this. I personally come from a community of about 4 or 5 players, and we have spent 1,000 in-game days in a Valheim world without a map or minimap. We use portals because we have to, and we have drawn maps by hand to navigate. It has been an immensely rewarding experience. But at some point, our institutional knowledge frayed the further out we explored, and before too long we became less methodical about mapping out each and every zone. Not only that, but our maps were not as accurate as we would have liked, resulting in a game of telephone with space, one that eventually became overwhelming. As of writing this, finding the Queen feels impossible, and we scour the Mistlands in vain, sprinting like the mad without any sort of reference point, because we have no compass, and the sun and the world tree disappear. Allowing players to shrink the size of the map gives these hardcore players a better chance. It's a key distinction to be made here. We're talking about exploring, rather than domestication. I can only imagine that the Ashlands and Deep North biomes will provide even more steep equipment requirements going forward, and the bolstering of bases with even more crafting stations will lead to an even more limited playstyle of exploring only the necessary, rather than exploring it all. I'm not going to sit here and suggest that this tension is at all easy to resolve. In fact, it may be impossible to. Several other games, most recently Enshrouded, have leaned more into action role-playing genres in order to fix this problem inherent in nomadic versus domestic playstyles, and some people enjoy it more, some people enjoy it less. What I love about Valheim is the immersion of the world and the freedom that the tools provide in its world. The problem is that these tools have been so leveraged by the late game that it presents the player with far fewer options than when they started. That sense of initiative, spontaneity, and collaboration in the early game gets far more difficult to replicate in the late game because of the narrowing of requirements into a far more vertical progression model rather than a model of trade-offs. Thanks for watching.